Hi, I'm Andy with the Deplorable General. Every Thursday night, we do a live local television show here in the York, Pennsylvania area. Between 8 and 8:30 in the evening, we do tactical tips, guns and gear reviews, and some political commentary. I do the show with my co-host, Evan. I, myself, am a military veteran. Evan has his experience in history and executive protection and the private security. So we both have countless hours of training and experience to bring to you bring to the table here. So tonight we started a two-part series on the evolution of the modern day firearm, starting from the 1300s up until the late 1800s in the first part, and our next part of the series next week will be from the 1900s on. So like I said, tonight we're from 1300s to about 1890 or so, and then next week we'll be up through the 1900s, which is actually the evolution of the modern day firearm. Actually started right in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So that's what we're going over tonight. Hope you guys enjoy. Without further ado. So the first ever recorded use of firearms was in 1364. Now, this is the first recorded use of personal firearms, because in 1260, the first cannons were used in the Battle of Ain Jalut. I guess is how you say it. I probably butchered that, but it was in the Middle East. The Mamluks against the Mongols was the first recorded use of cannons, gunpowder actually being used to fire stuff in 1260, and then in 1364, the first recorded use of firearms. Now, imagine this. You had a small cannon mounted on the end of a spear. And this little cannon device, it had gunpowder inside of it, and it was lit by a long match, basically, or a
match.
Like
it was a match.
match.
It was a fuse.
A fuse.
It was a fuse.
That they would reach up, and now initially this device just shot fire, and it was more so. I mean, I guess it could catch a person on fire, but it was more so just a fear mechanism to scare
psychological
people away.
warfare.
Exactly. So I got mini flamethrowers, so it definitely did damage, but it wasn't killing somebody really until they determined that you could put bits of clay and pieces of metal, rocks, or whatever you could find into the end of this spear, into this fire lance is what they called it, and actually project this stuff and actually kill people with it. So that was in 1364. Then in the 1380s, in Europe, they used these hand cannons. So they were basically the same exact thing. They were a small cannon that you would hold in your hand that you would light the exact same way. You'd use a fuse. The powder would be in a little tray inside of this thing, and you would light the fuse to this thing, and it would launch your projectiles out. Big, heavy, not very accurate, but it can be deadly, especially at close range. And then what Evan has here in this book, actually, it goes on to show
that was actually in the Turkish Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and is that the same as well? This one
Yeah, pretty much.
So in this book here, it shows the guns used in the 1400s during the Ottoman Empire, and actually they used personal firearms as a part of its regular infantry. One of the first times in history that an actual
PDW.
Yeah, and it's the first time that a military used and implemented in mass force and mass production actual firearms.
Yep.
So prior to that, it was all swordplay. That's it. You didn't have.
Armor piercing goes back to 10 BC with the crossbow.
Right. Exactly.
A lot of people think, well, that came along in World War I, or no, the bolts that they were used were nothing more than flying spikes. They had no fins on them. They were just solid
core.
No, it was English oak, rounded, with a steel bit, basically.
Yep.
And it was riveted to this wooden with fleshing.
Right.
And then, it'll go straight through, hey guys, your two-legged tin cans were optional at that point.
Right. Yeah, it didn't really matter much. Now, again, when you look at some of that armor back in that time, a lot of these modern firearms, or the historic firearms, prior to, other than the cannons, cannons launch balls and all kinds of big, heavy stuff, and it would rip people in half.
Yeah.
So, they were effective to it, but a lot of these personal weapons, they weren't really that effective, especially at a distance towards armor. So that's why they still weren't very popular. They started to be used a good bit in the 1400s, but they weren't the most preferred weapon of choice. At this time, these people, the Ottomans, still preferred the tip of a spear or a sword to take control.
And it's still that way today. In a lot of these third world countries, they're more. There was a platoon of Army Rangers, Airborne Division in Afghanistan, who got more respect for the tomahawks that they carried.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Than they did with their actual primary firearms.
Yeah, can you blame them?
No. Tomahawk is very
intimidating.
Yeah.
So in the 1400s, we don't have the exact date, but in the 1400s, in the late 1400s, the first matchlock gun appears. And the reason why we don't really know is because prior to this point,
1521 to be exact.
Well, it was that's when the first matchlock gun was patented.
Okay, that was when.
But prior to, so in the late 1400s, let's see, in 16.
It says 16th century here.
Yeah, so it'll be 1500s. So now in 1637 was the first proof marks that manufacturers put on their weapons. So prior to 1637, we have a hard time really identifying actual what existed, because all we had was people's word for it, and we had recorded history of different journal entries and stuff like that. We do have pieces of weapons that we found in archaeological digs and stuff like that, but so that would have been in the late. So the matchlock gun. Okay, guns were prior to that, just like we talked about the cannon. Guns were fired by holding a wick or a match directly to a powder tray on the gun.
Well, that's just like the matchlock. A matchlock is basically a shoulder fire cannon.
Right.
You want to get technical.
Well, and so, but what the difference was, though, is the matchlock had a match that was affixed to a clamp. Yeah, it was a wick or a match that was actually attached, though, to a clamp, which allowed the person to hold the weapon with two hands. Whereas prior to the matchlock being introduced, you had to hold with one hand and you had to light with another hand. So it severely decreased accuracy and effectiveness of these weapons. So that's pretty interesting. That's a pivotal point in firearms history.
Big time. And the thing about it is, they were using round balls.
Right.
And we still use in certain firearms round ball.
Yep.
And it's I guess that thing's killed everything for a long time, just a regular lead round ball.
Yeah, exactly. So, 1498, the rifling principle was discovered. Now,
I can't get over that.
We didn't see rifling in guns in 1498. They just discovered that if you put a twist inside of a barrel and you send something down through it, that something is going to twist with the twist in the barrel, and it's going to be more accurate and more effective. Just like you throw a football. If you can't throw a football, it took me years to learn how to throw a football. In high school, when everybody else could throw a football, just launch these bombs, I couldn't. I threw the things. They looked like, I don't even want to say what they looked like. They looked terrible, but they were all wobbly, and they only went like 15 feet. I threw this thing as hard as I could. Well, when I finally got that spin down, I could launch them. I could launch them.
It's all finger placement.
I know now, but I didn't then. I couldn't grasp it. I was clumsy. It was.
Well, we all were.
So, but when I got that spin, when I launched that football and it spun, it was accurate and it went farther. And it's the same concept with bullets. So they discovered that in 1498.
One thing I thought was very interesting about last week's show that you brought up was too much rifling.
Right.
They had to come up with a balance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, today we talk about a 308 with a 112 twist.
Right.
You know, that's maximum. And then here's what I think is so funny: my M1 Grand Barrel, National Match Barrel, is only like 1 in 4 twist, but they're deeper. Right. It's a deeper cut.
Yeah.
So you know, there again, but you're also talking what 60, 80 years. Yeah. You know.
Yep. Well, so the next step then in the evolution of the firearm was the wheel lock, okay? So this was an interesting time in firearms history because the wheel lock, it was a lot more effective, a lot more efficient.
Well, you can shoot it in the rain.
Exactly, that's a big thing. Don't you have a picture in here of the wheel lock?
Yeah,
so he's going to show you a picture. Now, this was actually a mechanism that was designed to light the powder
and it was used with a key. You actually had a key. You had to wind it up.
And now this was, like Evan said, this was designed to be able to use it in the rain while it's wet.
Here it is.
So
there's
go
the
ahead
wheel lock.
And take a look at this here real quick. And we're going to zoom in on that. Great. So now this is a really cool design. It was, but the problem with it though is it was twice the cost of a conventional firearm. So just because of the mechanism that lit,
it was actually the first handgun.
Right. Well, I mean, but it was still it was twice. It was very expensive.
It was uber expensive, you know, and that's why they're so ornate.
Right, and that's why only wealthy people had them. They were not popular again with the general population. Almost nobody had them except wealthy people. But nonetheless, it was a huge step in firearm evolution.
Big time. Well, like I said, you know, up to that point, you know, there's a reason that we have an expression: keep your powder dry.
Right, exactly.
And black powder, if anybody knows, black powder is a magnet for moisture.
Yep.
So anytime you have a firearm that is somewhat weather resistant,
yep,
you know, it puts you that one step further to survive in that fight.
Exactly. And the other thing though it was the first time where we started putting mechanics into
guns. Oh,
instead
big time.
Of just having a spring and a hammer and a piece of flint and or a match, we started adding mechanics to it and started saying, well, how can we make this better? It was the first time they really looked at the firearm and said, how can we build this better? And they did a great job of building it better. It was just really expensive.
Well, you know, it's just like comparing a factory Colt 1911 to a Les Baer or Guncraft or something like that. People say, well, I get a Colt for this price. Yes, you can. But when it comes to like a Cabot or something of that nature, you're talking about something that is handmade. They take their time.
Right, yep.
And the difference is, yes, a custom gun is not for everybody. But the thing about it is that custom gun will hold its value through eons past its, you know, what would normally be somebody's prime.
So in 1540, rifling actually starts to appear in firearms. They figured out how to actually put this rifling concept into a gun.
Amazing.
It was again another revolutionary period. But here's another step. 1540 was the rifling. In 1630. Okay, 1630, the first flintlocks were introduced. Again, now this was huge, okay, because what this did is it took a rock, a piece of flint, and it broke it into the piece of rock would hit the metal, it would make a spark, it would light the powder. So and that spark would light even if it was wet. So now this was a cheaper alternative to the wheel lock.
A lot cheaper.
And it made it affordable to everybody, but it was you know, kind of a step in between, so to speak. So flintlock was a huge advancement.
Well, we used the flintlocks all the way into the Revolutionary War.
Right, exactly. So, and we got about 7 minutes, so we'll try to fly through the rest of the...
time flies.
Let's see. In 1637, the first firearm manufacturer proof marks appeared. We started seeing manufacturers claiming their work. Then in between 1750 and 1850, there's a huge kind of gap here in history. However, here's the important thing. Dueling became popular. Okay, dueling. So people walking, 20 paces, turning around and shooting each other. That became very popular. It became popular amongst the wealthy and the common citizen. So what that did was that actually normalized the practice of people carrying pistols. Prior to this, only like military people, sailors, law enforcement were the only people who actually carried a firearm on a day-to-day basis. Well, from the 1750s to the 1850s, it became a normal practice for almost everybody to carry a pistol. And why? Because if they ever had to get in a duel, they would have a pistol to duel with. That was the whole purpose. But it wasn't for self-defense. Kind of an interesting little piece of history.
Andrew
there.
Jackson. he was an old dueler.
1776 was the Revolutionary War. In 1807, the percussion caps were designed. Percussion caps were simply just a cap that when the hammer would hit it, it would light the powder.
Funny one is Remington, when they were doing the caps.
Right.
Their manufacturer plant burned severely. In Connecticut. They had to rebuild their plant.
Really?
Because they got the mix a little too hot.
So then in 1835 we had the first Colt revolver. Okay, so
the Patterson.
Yep, and Evan touched on this. It was Samuel Colt's first company, and that company that actually went bankrupt, and then from there it went into the Colt Manufacturing Company, which is modern day Colts basically.
Well, that was actually
2003, right?
Yeah, but it was also where Walker saved the company.
Right.
Walker, Captain Walker came in and saved Colt
In the late 1800s.
The mid 1840s.
Yeah. 1840, then guns were made with pin-fired cartridges. Okay, so
in France, a lot of that was in France. Yep. A lot of that was overseas.
And these cartridges were actually paper cartridges. They were pin-fired. Here was the thing, though. So, like Evan said, most of these were originally made in Europe, not in the U.S. They did have them here, but with ammo in the U.S. was not mass-produced for these cartridges. So there were companies that were making them. There were companies that were shipping them in across the ocean to the U.S.
But it just depends on it depends on there again. What is the company? Just like we have variety of companies in France, you had a variety. I mean, mainly France would come up with these ornate pin-fire revolvers. 20 and 25 shot revolver. What was France like during that time that you needed so late?
Exactly. Well, and if you remember the scene, one of my favorite movies is The Patriot with Mel Gibson.
Oh yeah.
And if anybody's seen the movie, you remember the scenes actually where he melted down his son's figurines and casted his own lead balls. Mm-hmm. So they did have lead manufacturing companies, bullet manufacturing companies in that time where they mass-produced lead balls. However, one of the allures of these older muskets were that you could cast your own bullets, and it was done. It was easy to do. You had a piece of lead.
Iraqi veteran '88 with a Martini Henry.
Right. Well, and that
there again.
The nice thing is that so they could do that back then, and they couldn't cast their own cartridges. So when the cartridge, the pinfire cartridges came about, the musket was still very popular until we got a little bit farther in. So 1850s shotguns were mass produced.
I want to touch on the real quick the rocket ammo, which was the first self-contained ammunition. Mm-hmm. This is where the actual bullet had to charge in it. Right. Yeah, that's not something that lasted a long time, but they did exist.
Yep.
And then a feller by the name of Henry came up with a rimfire 44 cartridge and a lever action
in 1859.
Yeah, that's it.
Yep.
End the story right there, guys.
So in 1860, the Spencer repeating rifle. This is where I wanted to get to this point because the Spencer repeating rifle was the first magazine-fed lever-action rifle.
That was mass-produced.
Yeah, exactly. It was chambered in 56 by 56. And it had a 7-round tube magazine. Now it was used during the Civil War by the Union, but mostly by cavalry again because of the ability to mass produce ammunition. It
and
just
you
wasn't
could shoot
there.
it off the back of a horse.
Yep.
That was the
1861, breech guns were in common use. 65, the Civil War ended. 62, the Gatling gun was invented. In 69, the centerfire cartridge was introduced. And then in 1871 was the first cartridge revolver, the Colt model 1871 to 72. And then in 1873 was the Winchester rifles introduced, which had a 4440 cartridge, centerfire cartridge. This was the gun that won the West. Excellent weapon. Anyway, we're kind of running down on time here. That takes us pretty much into the 1900s, which we'll pick up next week.
Yep.
So I'm Andy.
I'm Evan.
And together, Deplorable General, over and out.